Hello, this is a presentation on my term paper, which was written on Ayer on the analytic-synthetic distinction. A.J. Ayer was a philosopher associated with the logical positivism, which was a school of analytic philosophy who worked in the 20th century. Um, they were, at core, a highly anti-metaphysical school of philosophy, and it seemed like that's pretty much what they were trying to say. Was that metaphysics is not genuine and is not philosophy. They were also very empirical, and they got a lot of their ideas from David Hume, who wrote in the 19th century. In particular, they got the idea of Hume's fork. Hume's fork was an idea developed by David Hume to explain a distinction in philosophical propositions. What he did was divided all propositions into either relations of ideas or matters of fact. And as we'll see, that eventually turned into analytic and synthetic propositions. So just to tell you from the get-go, what I plan to be doing for this paper is focusing in on Ayer's account of the analytic-synthetic distinction. I did read the entire book, but I didn't focus on every idea that he articulated. I pretty much focused just on that. And what I argued was, what I concluded was that his distinction was not successful. I don't think that he successfully demarcated the where we should draw the line, where an analytic proposition ends and where a synthetic proposition begins. Um, it seems that even by his account or his definition of what a synthetic proposition is, we can still include his own ideas of what an analytic proposition is into that account of a synthetic proposition. So basically, I think that his definition of synthetic propositions are too inclusive. So what is an analytic proposition? Basically, it's a proposition that's true or false solely in virtue of meaning alone. I've heard it explained as a proposition that is justified without experience, whatever that means. And Ayer basically thought that all these propositions are tautological. That's a logical term that means true in every situation. For every truth value that you can assign to the proposition, it comes out true. Um, he also said about them that they do not in themselves contain any information about any matter of fact. Um, so you can see how extreme he took this idea of analytic propositions to the extent that we can't get any information from them at all. He needed this for his ideas because what he what he was arguing for was very empirical in nature. So if it turned out that we can get all this useful and informative information out of simply relating ideas or out of definitions and concepts, then obviously that's not going to look too good for him. He needed to distance himself from that. That is something that Kant believed, that we could have synthetic information without experience um, a priori, but Ayer did reject that. So an example of an analytic proposition is either it is raining or it is not raining. That's of the form either P or not P, which is an instance of a tautology, which is going to be true no matter what truth value you assign to proposition P. Um, and all bodies are extended is another example of a analytic proposition, although it's a little bit different than the first one because it's not a tautology. Um, Although Ayer did believe that it could be reduced to a tautology, a lot of philosophers who came after him argued that it couldn't, and I agree with the later philosophers. But what he thought was that they're synonyms, and we can replace them with each other, and we can find the concept of extended in the concept of a body. So, what is our concept of a body? He thought it was just an extended object. Um, as you can see, he was very logical and didn't believe in vagueness. Very strictly logical person. What is a synthetic proposition? For Ayer, um, it's a hypothesis. Uh, the same kind of hypotheses that are used in scientific reasoning um, in all branches of science. He also thought that they were verifiable only by experience and reducible to observation statements. So we need experience, we need observation, and we need those statements, those observation statements, which are the basis of how we're going to verify these propositions. Um, this is a definition that he used quite often in the book. A synthetic proposition is a rule for the anticipation of future experience. Um, he seemed to believe that um, that's the best definition that we have of a synthetic proposition. He didn't give a lot of clear definitions about what it is, and I think that's the weakness in his paper, and that's where I chose to attack his paper. So some examples of synthetic propositions are all men are mortal, and there are ants which have established a system of slavery. Ayer specifically talks about both these examples. In the first one, um, well, he admits that a lot of philosophers before him thought this was analytic and necessary, which, by the way, he thought was just the same thing. Analytic is necessary. For him, there was no difference. Um, but he argued that we need experience to verify this, that our concept of a man is not found in our concept of mortality, or vice versa. So W.V.O. Quine was a philosopher who attacked the distinction um, on the basis of circularity. For Quine, the notion of analyticity is obscure, and the only way we can define it is in terms of necessity, which is a circular definition. And we don't have a very clear definition of necessity for Quine, so we should just abandon the whole idea. He thought that these propositions, instead of being discrete, kind of ran on a continuum. Um, so some of them are more central, some of them are more peripheral, but there really is no fundamental difference between them. He concluded that we should just abandon the entire analytic synthetic distinction at all. But I'd like to point out that although I was very influenced by this, these ideas that came from Quine, I'm not exactly arguing the same thing. I don't believe that there is no analytic synthetic distinction. That is kind of an extreme claim to make. I believe Quine took empiricism to its logical conclusion, which is just to say that, everything's experience. There's no difference. But I didn't take my argument that far. It's hard to sustain those kind of conclusions, as we found out. Another philosopher who worked on the analytic synthetic was Weismann. He was influenced by Wittgenstein um, and the whole thing about ordinary language philosophy. A lot of his ideas you can see came out of there. So I think of it as getting a good idea of what Wittgenstein himself would say about this. Um, so he thought that language is too ambiguous, that we can't apply these terms to any concrete examples of the way people are going to speak. For instance, if someone were to say time is measurable, that's very abstract. And how are we going to decide if it's analytic or synthetic without putting it in context? After we put it in context, we find out that these terms are open-ended. We don't know for sure what they mean in the abstract. We need the context. So basically what he was saying, that it's just too vague and too ambiguous. For instance, you were just on time, and the time it took me to drive here. I mean, maybe the second one is measurable, but I don't know about the first instance. This is my argument formalized in premise conclusion format. So the first premise is all genuine propositions are either analytic or synthetic, and not both. Um, I think this is something that most people would accept as basic, obviously not Quine, but most of us would admit that there is something that is analytic and there is something that is synthetic, and we can kind of intuitively know what they are. So I consider the premise to be self-evident. The second premise, all propositions that are either analytic or synthetic are genuine. This comes directly from Ayer's text. He divided propositions into genuine and not genuine. Anything that was metaphysics is not genuine. Everything else is genuine, and that includes analytic and synthetic statements. So from two, we get three, which says that all analytic propositions are genuine propositions. And the next premise is another basic premise. All genuine propositions are a rule for the anticipation of future experience. This premise in particular, Ayer would not agree with. He wouldn't accept it. I believe it to be true, and I do discuss that at length in my paper, give a couple of arguments for it. But if you were to accept this premise, then Ayer would have a problem. From 3 and 5, we get all analytic propositions are a rule for the anticipation of future experience, which is also logically something that Ayer wouldn't accept. So from 1, we get that if all and only synthetic propositions are a rule for the anticipation of future experience, then analytic propositions are not a rule for the anticipation of future experience. If you look at, I wrote all and only synthetic propositions, which excludes analytic propositions. So that's how I got that consequent. And 7, the conclusion by Modus Tollens, it is not the case that all and only synthetic propositions are a rule for the anticipation of future experience. I forgot to write the premises in there, but that is from 6 and 5. So it's a Modus Tollens from 5 and 6. So analytic reconsidered. Can mathematical and logical propositions be informative and useful? Consider 56 to the 4th power equals 9,834,496. I mean, obviously, if I told you that before you knew the answer, you wouldn't know the answer. You would have no idea what it is. It's not anything that you have in your concept of 56 or to the power of 4 or 56 to the power of 4. Something that you need quite a bit of work to do, or a calculator. But nevertheless, it's hard to say how exactly that necessarily follows, or or that it's analytic, or that it can be reduced to some logical principle. Um, so consider wake up when I wake up tomorrow morning, either it will be raining or it won't be. Granted, this is a logical guarantee. One of those two will obtain tomorrow morning when I wake up. Nevertheless, doesn't it tell you something? Or if it didn't tell you anything, then wouldn't it just be nonsense? It must be saying something about the world. A more obvious example is a right angle is a 90-degree angle. So this is something that arguably Ayer would say is analytic, because the idea of a right angle, or our concept of what a right angle is, kind of follows that it's a 90-degree angle. That is pretty much the definition. Nevertheless, that is a useful proposition. We can use it to derive all other kinds of geometrical problems and measure different kinds of angles and deduce different conclusions from different kind of things. I think it's useful. Consider by analogy, this is not an analytic proposition, but by mixing blue and yellow paint, you will get green paint. That will happen every time that you mix those two colors. You will get green, just like every time that you punch 56 to the fourth power, you're going to get that answer in the calculator. It doesn't make it less useful, though. If you're a painter, that's pretty useful information. So, aren't these, isn't logic and mathematics useful? Aren't these definitions useful? Don't we use them in ordinary life situations? I believe that the case could be made that we do find them useful and informative, and a lot of the time surprising even. So with that, I have this critique of Ayer's distinction. I argue that he has not successfully demarcated the analytic and synthetic. Ayer's account of synthetic propositions does not exclude propositions he considers to be analytic. If he's not given us a reason to believe that an analytic proposition cannot be used as a rule for the anticipation of future experience, then we have reasons to doubt his distinction. And what I believe, what I've been writing about, is that these propositions that are analytic can be used as a rule for the anticipation of future experience. My conclusion is that although it seems plausible that there is an analytic-synthetic distinction, we need a more plausible account of exactly what the nature is of the analytic-synthetic distinction. I'm not Quine, and I don't believe that there is no distinction. I believe it's kind of just intuitive that there is. There are a lot of borderline cases, which is a reason a lot of people have rejected it. Nevertheless, it seems to be there. It seems to be something we all agree on. So I'm not arguing that there is no distinction there. Just arguing that Ayer's particular explanation of what it is in Language, Truth, and Logic is kind of obscure. In particular, his definition of what a synthetic distinction is. I think his definition of analyticity is, besides for the fact that he holds it necessary, is correct. But when he starts talking about synthetic, it seems to get pretty obscure. And with that, I conclude.